Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we bring you stories that challenge the mind and stir the soul. Today's story is one of truth, justice, and the power of perseverance. It follows an investigative journalist determined to uncover the truth behind a tragic cover-up, one that has haunted a city for years. When a hidden video emerges, it sends shockwaves through the community, exposing corruption at the highest level. But the fight for justice is far from over. What happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat as we follow a gripping journey of accountability, resistance, and redemption. If you love stories filled with unexpected twists and powerful life-changing moments, be sure to comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an inspiring story from Hopeful Horizon. And let us know where you're listening from. The courthouse hummed with controlled chaos. The rhythmic clatter of shoes against the marble floors echoed through the hallways as attorneys hurried from one courtroom to the next. The air was thick with anticipation, plaintiffs clutching case files, public defenders whispering hurried strategies, and uniformed officers standing stiffly by the doors, their watchful eyes surveying the crowd. Officer Greg Daniels strutted through the corridor with the arrogant ease of a man who believed himself untouchable. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a crisp uniform pressed to perfection, he had spent years building a reputation based on fear. His presence alone made civilians flinch, and his colleagues whisper knowingly behind his back. To them, he was a necessary evil, a bulldog that kept the streets in check no matter the cost. Daniel's gaze landed on a black woman standing near the courtroom entrance, speaking quietly to a well-dressed black man. Something about her composure irritated him. The quiet confidence, the way she held herself as though she belonged. He had dealt with plenty like her before. Trouble. His grip on his belt tightened as he approached. "You don't belong here. Move it, or I'll move you." The woman turned slowly, her dark brown eyes locking onto his with a calm intensity. "Excuse me?" Daniel's lips curled in irritation. "You heard me. Unless you're waiting to be processed, get out of my courthouse." The suited man beside her stiffened. "Officer, you might want to—" Daniels wasn't interested. With one swift motion, he reached for the woman's wrist, twisting it behind her back with a practiced efficiency. The clink of metal as the handcuffs snapped into place reverberated through the hallway. Conversations ceased, eyes turned. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. She didn't fight, didn't scream, didn't so much as flinch. She simply exhaled through her nose and held his gaze, unshaken. "You're making a mistake," she said evenly. "Oh, I don't think so," Daniels sneered. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The door to the nearest courtroom swung open. A judge, mid-stride, came to a sudden halt, his face paling as he took in the sight before him. "Officer Daniels," he barked, his voice laced with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing? That's Chief Renee Carter." Silence suffocated the hallway. Daniels felt the blood drain from his face. The weight of his mistake settled in an instant. Daniels' fingers fumbled as he unclipped the cuffs, his usual bravado crumbling under the judge's piercing glare. The metallic clang as they hit the floor echoed louder than it should have. Renee Carter rolled her wrists, expression unreadable as she watched him. Her suit was pristine, her demeanor unchanged, but there was something in her eyes, something sharp, something calculating. "Mistaken identity," Daniels stammered. You were acting suspicious. I didn't recognize—" "I'm sure you didn't," Renee said, smoothing out the cuffs of her blazer. "Because if you had, you would have known this is a mistake you won't recover from." The tension in the hallway was suffocating. Officers who once stood in Daniel's shadow suddenly found the floor more interesting. The suited man at Renee's side, Assistant District Attorney Malik Thompson, shook his head in quiet amusement. "You should go," the judge said to Daniels, rubbing his temples as though warding off a migraine. "Now." Daniels swallowed hard, retreating with quick, clipped steps, his heart pounding against his ribs. That night, in the privacy of her office, Renee didn't waste time. She called for an internal review on Daniels, pulling up records of complaints, misconduct allegations, and disciplinary reports that had mysteriously gone nowhere. It didn't surprise her. The system had protected men like Daniels for years, shielded them behind bureaucracy and silence. But she wasn't here to play by their rules. Her Her team worked tirelessly, compiling evidence, brutality cases, falsified reports, coerced confessions. Each file was another crack in the foundation Daniels had built his career on. But there was something else, something deeper, a cold case from 3 years ago, buried beneath mountains of paperwork. Jamal Porter, a black teenager found dead in a river. Official cause of death, accidental drowning. Renee clicked through the files, eyewitness statements that were ignored, autopsy reports that contradicted themselves, a single name appearing over and over again, Officer Greg Daniels. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just a case of misconduct. This was murder. The next morning, Renee stood before a row of cameras and reporters, the courthouse looming behind her. Flashbulbs flickered, microphones angled forward, the air electric with anticipation. "For too long," she began, "we have allowed officers who abuse their power to hide behind a badge. That ends today. I am officially reopening multiple cases tied to documented misconduct, including the 2019 death of Jamal Porter." Across the city, in his dimly lit apartment, Daniels watched the broadcast with wide, unblinking eyes, his hands curled into fists. For the first time in his career, he felt something foreign, something he never imagined he would feel. Fear. 3 years ago, the sun had barely risen over the city when a jogger found a body floating face down in the murky waters of the Hudson River. The victim was a 17-year-old black teenager named Jamal Porter. The police were quick to label it an accident, a tragic case of a kid getting involved in the wrong crowd, maybe falling into the river while running from something, or simply slipping in a moment of bad luck. Case closed. But Renee Carter was looking at the case with fresh eyes. Sitting in her office, she flipped through the old files, each page reeking of a rushed job. Eyewitness reports were inconsistent, the autopsy report was strangely vague, and the crime scene photos didn't match up with the official cause of death. Most chillingly, the last officer to see Jamal alive was none other than Greg Daniels. Renee leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply. "This isn't just misconduct," she muttered. "This is murder." She called her team in for an emergency meeting. "I want every detail of this case reviewed," she instructed, her voice unwavering. "We start from scratch. Witnesses, reports, surveillance, anything that ties Daniels to Jamal's death." Meanwhile, Daniels was already moving to cover his tracks. He met with his old colleagues, those who had helped him before. "I need this case buried," he growled at a junior officer who was now a detective. "Find the old files, get rid of them. We never saw that kid that night." But what Daniels didn't know was that Renee had already made copies of everything, and she wasn't working alone. That evening, she held a press conference. Standing tall in front of a sea of reporters, she addressed the city. "We are reopening the case of Jamal Porter," she announced. "New evidence has come to light, and we are determined to bring justice to this young man and his family." Within hours, social media exploded. The hashtag #Justice for Jamal trended nationwide. Protests ignited outside the courthouse, and Jamal's mother, who had spent years demanding answers, finally had hope. Daniels, watching the news in his darkened apartment, felt the cold grip of panic for the first time in his life. The walls were closing in. Daniels had spent years building his empire of corruption, but now it was crumbling before his eyes. He stormed into the precinct the next morning, his face twisted in rage. "This is a damn witch hunt," he spat at his fellow officers. "They're coming for all of us." But the room was silent. The men who once covered for him, who once laughed at his crude jokes and backed up his false reports, were now looking at him with unease. Renee's investigation wasn't just targeting him, it was pulling others down with him. That same day, Renee confronted the medical examiner who had ruled Jamal's death an accident. She found him in his office, his hands shaking as he flipped through old case files. "I know you were forced to change that report," she said, sitting across from him. "Daniels threatened you, didn't he?" The man hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. Finally, he exhaled and nodded. "He said if I didn't mark it an accident, my career was over." Renee slid a recorder onto the desk. "Say it again." He did, and with that, Daniels lost another layer of protection. But the final blow came from an unexpected source, an anonymous tip. A retired officer, once a rookie under Daniel's command, reached out. He agreed to meet Renee in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. "I have something for you," the man said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "What's on it?" Renee asked. "Proof," he whispered. "Proof that Daniels killed that boy, and that others helped cover it up." Renee plugged the drive into her laptop that night, her heart pounding as she opened the file. A grainy dashcam video flickered onto the screen. It showed Jamal Porter, alive and terrified, being shoved into the backseat of a squad car. The timestamp matched the night he disappeared. The video cut to another scene, Daniels and two officers standing over Jamal near the riverbank. The last frame showed Daniels grabbing Jamal by the collar. Then the screen went black. Renee stared at the screen, her breath shallow. The final nail in the coffin had just been hammered in, and Greg Daniels had no idea what was coming next. The air inside the press conference room was thick with anticipation. Reporters from every major news outlet had crammed into the space, cameras positioned, microphones extended, ready for what was about to unfold. At the front of the room, Renee Carter stood tall, a folder in her hand, her expression unreadable. Behind her, a massive screen displayed a paused video, one the public had never seen before. "This footage," Renee began, her voice steady, "was recovered from a hidden dashcam. It captures events from 3 years ago, the night Jamal Porter lost his life. Until now, the official story claimed his death was an accident." She exhaled, her jaw tightening. "But we're about to see the truth." The room fell silent as the video began. The footage was grainy, but the voices were clear. Jamal, a 17-year-old black boy, stood on the side of the road, hands raised, as two officers, one of them Daniels, approached. "Where you headed, boy?" Daniel's voice slithered through the speakers. Jamal's voice wavered. "I was just walking home." A rough shove, the sound of Jamal stumbling, then a grunt of pain. "You got something to hide," Daniels demanded. Jamal's breathing grew frantic. "No, sir, I swear I—" A loud crack echoed, Daniel's baton striking Jamal's ribs. A collective gasp rippled through the press room. The video jumped, a brief static flicker, before showing Jamal being dragged toward the squad car, his body limp. The last image was Daniels standing at the riverbank, Jamal barely moving beneath him. Then the footage cut out. For a moment, silence. Then chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions. People gasped. On social media, the clip spread like wildfire, fueling an already brewing storm. Hashtags demanding justice for Jamal dominated the internet. Protests ignited outside the courthouse, at police stations, in front of City Hall. The mayor, who had previously sidestepped the case, now had no choice but to address it. Daniels, watching from home, felt his stomach turn to stone. His phone buzzed repeatedly, but none of his old allies were answering. He was a man marked for downfall, and he knew it. He had one move left: run. The night was cold. The city streets blurred under the dull glow of streetlights. Inside an old pickup truck, Daniels gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Sweat dripped from his brow despite the freezing temperature. His heart pounded as he approached the highway exit. If he could just cross state lines, disappear into some quiet town, change his name. A flash of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. Shit. Daniels slammed his foot onto the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching, but the police cars behind him accelerated too, engines roaring like wolves in pursuit. "This is the police. Pull over now," a voice commanded through a loudspeaker. Daniels ignored it. He swerved onto an empty side road, hoping to shake them. But just as he turned the corner, another set of headlights flooded his vision. A blockade. He was surrounded. With no options left, he yanked the truck onto the shoulder, jumped out, and ran. His breath was ragged, his lungs burning. He could hear the officers closing in, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. "Freeze, Daniels!" He didn't. He sprinted toward an alleyway, but a figure stepped into his path. Renee Carter. She wasn't in uniform. She didn't need to be. The look in her eyes stopped him in his tracks. "You're done," she said, her voice like steel. For the first time, Daniels felt powerless. The game was over. Hands grabbed him from behind, shoving him to the ground. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," an officer recited. Daniels didn't speak. He couldn't. His face was buried in the pavement, a fitting end for a man who had spent years pressing others into the dirt. The courtroom was packed. The city wanted to see this trial. Renee sat in the front row, her presence unwavering. Across the aisle, Jamal Porter's mother clutched a photograph of her son, tears streaking down her face. Daniels, now in an orange jumpsuit, sat with his attorney. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who knew his fate was sealed. The charges were read aloud: murder, corruption, obstruction of justice. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. The officers who once stood by him, they testified against him. The medical examiner admitted to falsifying reports. The retired rookie officer exposed the entire cover-up. Daniel's sentence: life without parole. Outside, the city exhaled. It wasn't just about Daniels. It was about the culture that had protected him, and now that system was beginning to crack. As Renee stepped out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, asking if this was the end. Her answer was simple. This was never just about one bad cop. It's about the system that lets them exist, and we're not stopping here. In a prison cell miles away, Daniels sat alone. No power, no badge, just another criminal brought to justice. And for the first time in his life, there was no one left to protect him. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of truth, justice, and accountability. This story reminds us that standing up against corruption isn't just about exposing one person. It's about challenging the system that allows it to exist. It takes courage, determination, and a relentless pursuit of what's right. If this story moved you, don't forget to comment below and let us know what you think. We'd also love to hear where you're listening from. And, of course, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss another impactful story. We'll be back soon with more tales that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after they're over. Thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay strong, and always fight for justice.